All right. Yeah, we should be live. Hello, everyone. So I'm joined here today with Ben, and he has some socialist videos he wants to react to. He's muted at the moment. There we go.
I am back. Yeah, I just wanted to brush up on a few things because I didn't know you were going to do the second video on the same stream, but I'm cool with that.
Yeah, I mean, it should be fine. The first one's like, 10 minutes or something.
Yeah, it's not that long, and we'll make quick work of it, I would say.
Yeah. Gonna let me pop this out. Yeah, here we go. Fucking flies.
Socialism has become
failed in all countries where attempted.
Every time a country started down the socialist path, it
because
failed.
Marxism doesn't work.
Give
It's
me
a
one
positive
second.
thing. It's a way of running an economy. Marxism ruins everything.
Before we get into this, when I
you're
started
hosting,
this
so you'll have
video,
to
it
pause.
was supposed to be about highlighting successful socialist experiments, which it still is.
there we
But
go.
as I kept researching and reading, a common theme popped up. Whenever a socialist state started to see success, it was immediately met with Western-backed sanctions or coups d'etats. Now, this is...
Let's stop right there. Yeah, this is kind of one of the reasons I wanted to do a stream about this stuff with you, because I know you mostly cover the theory stuff, which is incredibly important and probably more important than many of these things that I'll cover. But also, I want people to know, like, when you encounter things like this, how to respond to them, because most socialists don't want to talk about ethics, especially ethics, because they're incredibly immoral people and they know nothing about ethics. But they're not equipped to talk about theory either. So you can drag them around on theory all day, but they're too dumb to even realize what's happening. So they'll just bring up random silly things like this, attempting to falsify the theory, but not actually engaging with it. And this is the most common one that you'll find is, oh yeah, we had socialist countries, but the U.S. always goes after them. This is just wrong at a surface level. There's been there's been over 24 like blatantly socialist countries, and I'm talking like, countries run by Marxists and stuff like that. If you want to expand that and say having a country where the government contributes most to GDP, or most industry is state owned or whatever else, then you can probably add a lot more to that list. But in recent years, like post Karl Marx, so on and so forth, post Soviet Union, we've had about 23 or so. And Somalia, Tanzania, Burma, countries like this spent years being socialist and never had the U.S. bomb them. They never had the U.S. come in and sabotage them. In fact, in some cases, the U.S. was supporting them a lot. In Tanzania, they were getting more foreign aid than most other countries in the world back under Julius Nyerere. So, no, the U.S. wasn't sabotaging them. In fact, the U.S. was helping them succeed. Now, I mean, foreign aid generally does not actually help a country, but that's besides the point. The U.S. was making efforts to help them, and they still failed miserably. They failed so miserably that Julius Nyerere resigned. He was incredibly popular. He was there leading the anti-colonial movement. Right? He was there when Zanzibar and Tanganyika, that's what Tanzania was. It was Zanzibar and Tanganyika combined into one country. It was there when they got independence. And he was incredibly popular, and he screwed everything up so bad that he had to resign, and then they liberalized the economy and everything got better shortly after he resigned. It's a very consistent story with these other countries. In the case of Somalia, the socialist government went to war with Ethiopia, another socialist country. They committed genocide against the Astaka people, killed hundreds of thousands of them, and then their entire state collapsed, and Somalia became basically stateless, and it actually improved. Stateless Somalia was much better than socialist Somalia. Imagine my shock, right?
Yeah,
I'm not sure how familiar you are with stateless Somalia.
not particularly, but I mean, I suppose like just on this sort of idea that, like, it kind of contradicts their whole thesis that, like, socialism will necessarily usher in just like a state of super productivity and super humans all abound. Then how on earth were some, bourgeois capitalists across the world able to ever put a spanner in that works? If this is the arrow of history is on the Marxist side, and they're going to be way more productive in every respect, because it's like, oh, but did you know that the Marxists, they got into space first? Like slung a dog up there. It's like, okay, well, you can't have that. You can't claim they're way more productive, and also the apparently way less productive people were able to outdo them and be able to work around them so well.
Yeah, there's a lot of contradictions there. I mean, they honestly fall into great man theory a lot, which is funny because they love critiquing great man theory as if it's the only like theory of history that exists. But like, I saw you arguing with one a couple months ago, and you're asking him why he was advocating for communism if it's inevitable or something to that effect, and he couldn't really give a straight answer. So I started asking people very similar questions, and they're like, well, I have to advocate it to actually bring it along. And I'm like, well, what if you stopped? Would it not happen? I'm like, well, no. I'm like, yeah, I mean, you can't say it won't happen if you stop, because then you'd be buying into the great man theory. And you can't say that, like, and if you say the truth, or I mean, say what you actually believe, apparently, that it'll still happen if you stop advocating for it, then you've conceded that you don't have to advocate for it, yet you're still doing it. And it's entirely they don't have any actual answers to this.
And in fact, on their premises, they should be the greatest advocates of capitalism ever. Because only when capitalism finishes and comes to its ultimate crescendo, that socialism can happen. So, like, they should be advocating that people listen to us.
Yeah, I mean, some of the people, like infrared people, some of the MAGA communists, they say some stuff like that, but they're still quite inconsistent with it. But yeah, I mean, overall, basically what this guy is saying is the great man theory is true. There were some great men flying planes, and they dropped bombs, and they stopped the march of history with their bombs. So I guess that's a concession that Marxism is false. Let's go.
Something I already knew, but I didn't fully contend with this fact until I was 2 days into editing this video. That's when I realized I was asking the wrong question. I should have been asking, does socialism always fail? And if it does, is it due to an integral flaw with the concept? Or is it due to constant stifling from the imperial core? I'll leave that up to you. Here is the video. A common response by the left to the claim that every socialist experiment failed is to claim that those failed socialist states weren't truly socialist. This is a claim I don't necessarily disagree with, by the way. I do believe that many old communist states devolved into tyranny and state capitalism due to the fact that the old oppressive dynamic between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat wasn't appropriately challenged or dismantled. Instead, the state just mirrored that same dynamic, resulting in the people's subordination to the state instead of their subordination to the capitalist class. This is a contested topic, but we don't even need to argue on these grounds. For the sake of this,
I don't know if I'm able to pause or not. So this is an interesting argument here. He's making the claim that, like, well, this socialist, the USSR in particular, it was tyrannical because it kept on the same old bourgeois method of subjugating the workers to the bourgeois. Instead, it's just replacing the bourgeois with the state, and it's subjugating the workers to the state. But then I'm confused about what actually would his ideal be, because on Hegel, and of course Marx copies Hegel on this front, the ideal situation would be with where there is no individual. The individual doesn't actually properly exist. The individual is merely a cell in the collective body. So it's proper that the individual should be subjugated to the collective. So I'm not entirely sure why exactly he is criticizing that all these individuals are subjugated to the collective. If he wants individualism, then have capitalism, right? You can't. Wait, what does he want? Does he want a bunch of? Does he want Galt's Gulch with a bunch of Ayn Rand heroes running around, or not?
Let me. You still there?
Yeah.
Okay. My audio messes up on the audio interface sometimes. That's why it needs to get a new one.
Yeah.
But that's in the mail. That'll be here soon. Yeah. So yeah. Oh, okay. So this was I was gonna say. There is something I bring up a lot with socialists, and it's something I don't hear brought up much. I mean, the general concept is that they'll say we want the means of production to be socially owned or collectively owned or owned by the workers, so on and so forth. And I don't ask them what the means of production are. And they'll usually use conventional definition, which is land, labor, and capital. And then I ask them, well, what does it mean to have labor socially owned? I mean, you're saying you don't want privately owned means of production, right? So you don't have any privately owned labor. Labor isn't something that's really necessarily material. No, it's not an object. It's not like something that you can hold, something you can pass on to another person, right? It's your time, it's your effort. It's not something that can necessarily be separated from you. So if you are taking away all private labor, you're saying no individual owns their own labor, thus someone else owns it. In this case, some sort of collective, whether it be the state or just everybody, the proletariat, whatever they're going to say. They have inconsistent definitions. So, I mean, that's the definition of slavery. If you don't own your own labor, if someone else owns your labor, that's slavery.
Mhm.
And so, like, what he's describing here is the state owning people's labor and thus subjugating them, saying you have to work here. If you violate these laws, we're going to put you in the gulag to learn your lesson. You're going to do labor for us in the gulag because we own your labor. And then saying, oh, I'm against that. Well, no, you're not against that. That's exactly what you advocate for.
Yeah, it's like they don't have the kind of mental capacity to understand like the actual practical implications of the things that they're advocating for. Like if they just think through it like you've just done there, what they are advocating for is exactly what the Soviet Union achieved. They should be celebrating the Soviet Union for achieving this state of poverty, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a reason the Soviet Union was the longest lasting socialist country, right? It's because it was the one that actually did socialism the most, closer than any of them, and consistently did it, and got all the support from the socialists. And they were able to subjugate the entire country consistently for decades. And of course, that involved impoverishing it, and in some cases, the state coming close to collapse, the entire country coming close to collapse. And I would point out that they were able to chug along due to the efforts of entrepreneurial people, massive black markets. That's something you find consistently in these socialist economies. Now, from there, we could get into Mises a little bit and the economic calculation problem, because that's something that some people will bring up. Oh, well, the Soviet Union lasted really long, therefore he doesn't exist or whatever.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, the Soviet Union is not exactly what Mises is talking about. I mean, it is in a way, it's not in a way. So Mises is talking about socialism on the grounds of what the socialists are actually advocating for, right? He's granting him, like, you get exactly what you want. Like, there's no longer these capitalists. There's no longer this private property. Now, in real life, that's not exactly what happens because, again, massive black markets, people will pay off the bureaucrats to say, leave my private business alone. This is something that happens in North Korea today, happens in Cuba today, and it happened in the Soviet Union. So these people are still operating on markets, although highly suppressed markets. So, like, they were the ones feeding everybody. A majority of the food was provided by privately owned farms, privately owned agriculture. So, I just wanted to make that point. the entire country didn't, fall to the economic calculation problem precisely because it was not just purely socialist. If it was, it would have collapsed instantly.
Mhm. Yeah, so I suppose at this point I could give the basic argument behind the economic calculation problem. I have it written down. Where's it going to give me this? Yes, here we go. I'll also put this in the chat in case anybody wants to follow through it. So, like, the basic idea is that if you don't have any private control of the factors of production, the means of production in socialist terms, then you can't trade them, of course. Because me just moving a glass from my right hand into my left hand isn't trade. It's all controlled by the one agency, or the one guy, or whatever it is. Pardon me. So if you don't have any prices on the factors, then you can't do any profit loss calculations. You can't go, okay, how much did it cost me to make this car in this way, as against how much am I getting from it for it, right? So that means that you can't tell when you're being efficient in making something. So maybe you're making the car through, hand labor, and you're thinking, oh, would it be better to use robots to build this car? Well, the robots are going to take up a bunch of resources as well. So it's not clear, just right off the bat. But if you could have prices on those robots and prices on the laborers, then you could figure out, okay, it might actually be cheaper if this specific part of it was automized, and so on and so forth. You can't do that sort of calculation in the socialist commonwealth. So you just don't know when you're being inefficient. And the big claim here is that therefore there isn't actually an economy in the precise sense, because there is no social economization going on. You can't deliberately move towards the most value productive arrangement of the factors that you have. There is no economy, therefore. It's just kids playing market at best.
Even worse, Mises describes it as death.
Mhm.
There's that common quote a lot of people share around in memes and little quote boxes. I think it's actually a bit wrong, a bit off, but at the same point, it's basically like choosing between socialism and capitalism is like choosing between cyanide and water. I think he actually
Mhm.
says milk in Human Action, if I remember correctly. But that's not just like a silly little line. That's not a silly little jab at the socialist. Like when he's writing this, if you read the whole page, these full sections, like he is quite literally saying you are choosing between life and death.
Mhm.
And then at another point, he says like the only freedom you have left in a society like this is the freedom to kill yourself.
Yeah.
You don't have any other freedom. That's the only thing you have left.
And
It's really depressing, but it's
ideally,
also really
for the
telling.
socialists, you wouldn't have that freedom either. The state would be like, sorry, no, you're not allowed to kill yourself yet. We need you to get into this line of production. You'd have no ability to think, even, right? Because in order to think, you have to be free to use your mind. And this is sort of a more Randian point, where if you don't have the right to act freely, then you're just a tool. You're just a cog. You are no longer a man any longer, right? You are just being told, you're being ordered what to do every point. So you can't use your mind to decide what is best to do. But it's your mind. It's the productive mind, which is required for all of these values to be produced, all of this productive activity to go on. So they are destroying the own root of their sustenance. So describing it as death is very apt.
Yeah, and or like an actual example of kind of the difference of what we're talking about here with like Mises's socialism, which he does talk about the Soviet Union and in Human Action, and he kind of like and he talks about Nazi Germany as well, because he's kind of like, well, why were these so-called socialist economies? I mean, we do call them socialist, but he's like economic calculations possible. So how were their socialist economies? And he points out very similar things to I said. These massive black markets, they still utilized money, and They were able to have some market prices, although very, very, very little. And yeah, and I'm talking about like the prices that the government was setting. They were able to mimic some market prices because they had, other capitalist countries.
Mhm.
A purely socialist economy would not have that, and they would not attempt to act like a capitalist
Mhm.
economy. So that's kind of the distinction here. Now, we actually had one example of this. Maybe you could say two, but there's one major example, and that would be war communism, which is what the Soviets did initially. And they were going to completely get rid of money. They were doing moneyless planning. They got to the point where over 90% of labor compensation was paid in commodities instead of money. Well over 90% of industry was nationalized. And what happened? Instant collapse. Everything, death. Exactly what Mises described. It was death. Millions of people died and complete chaos. And nothing was getting better. Everything was getting worse by the day by amounts that you can't even comprehend. Like you can't even imagine what people were going through. Absolute misery. And to fix this, they had to reinstate money. I actually have one of the very first coins that they put out in what was it, 1923. They instituted the new economic policy, and they reprivatized tons and tons of industry, allowed for markets, economic calculation, so on and so forth. And that's how they were able to recover. And they never went back to what war communism was. They went away from the new economic policy eventually, and things got significantly worse. That was the most prosperous period in Soviet history, and it's not a coincidence that it was.
Mhm.
But from there, they always maintained this, pseudo private economy. Again, the black markets, some private industry that was able to exist, because they recognized. I mean, the Soviet planners explicitly recognized that they would never be able to have a socialist economy like they envisioned, and they even admitted Mises was right.
Mhm. Yeah, what's that one guy who said that in the future, Central Planning Bureau, they'd have a statue of Mises? I think it was a Polish socialist.
It might have. Not sure. I know Bukharin talked about Mises a bit, but I don't think he was Polish. He was Russian.
Yeah, you good to go?
Yeah.
For the sake of this video, I will not invoke the "it was state capitalist" argument. Another common approach to the claim that every socialist state was a failure is to hype up the accomplishments of past totalitarian regimes, like the Soviet Union. Now, I'm very critical of the USSR and their egregious human rights violations, but we should be able to highlight and, more importantly, learn from what they did manage to accomplish, and do so without playing defense for them. I don't think that any modern leftist should be defending Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, or any other despotic figure, especially when we have tried and true examples of successful socialist experiments that did not result in mass purges of the innocent, hard labor camps, or killing fields. And that leads me to how, in this video, I will delineate between what I consider to be successful and unsuccessful socialist experiments. The three major criteria I will use to determine if a socialist experiment was a success are: 1. It improved the quality of life for the most amount of people. 2. It replaced a regime that was significantly worse. And 3. It did so without resulting in any sort of human rights catastrophe.
I just want to do a little spoiler alert. He doesn't do any of these three things, by the way.
That's actually
I think he
not bother
completely
typing them
forgot.
down.
No, I think he legitimately totally forgot about them. He doesn't come back to this at all. All right.
A few things I want to really quickly touch on before we get into the thick of this video. Oftentimes, when a socialist country experiences economic or political hardship, there are anti-communists ready to gleefully bask in its suffering so that they could place the blame on socialism. I shouldn't have to point out how obviously
Doyle
inhumane this
cameo.
is. I would not point to the crippled economy of Argentina at the hands of anarcho-capitalist Javier Milei and
Now, see, this part, I love this part. I really annoys me because he's like, "Oh, I'm not going to be bad faith," and then proceeds to be incredibly bad faith.
Mhm.
Like I just said, he doesn't go back to those things. He doesn't really talk about the previous governments in any of these countries he discusses, or the previous economic systems. He doesn't do it here either. He just brings up Milei, and he's like, "Milei impoverished Argentina." No, no, it was like that. It was like that for a while. The poverty rate was increasing since 2013, buddy. I mean, like literally 10 years, and I mean, it's just now going down. And things are going to be a little rough from here. I expect. You have the example of Poland, communist country that went through shock therapy under a libertarian chief of economy,
Mhm.
very similar to Millet. And yeah, things were a bit messy at first. I mean, you would expect them to be. You're basically putting everything into a recession and trying to, go back to a blank slate and then start over. That kind of has to happen most of the time. But Poland went from being one of the poorest light states to surpassing most of them with their very rapid reforms. And it performed much better than other nations in terms of because it went so extreme with it. They went really hardcore, cutting taxes, privatizing. I mean, maybe the only other country that might have beat them was Georgia. Um, but yeah, I mean, anyways, like this is just complete nonsense. All this stuff was extremely bad in Argentina. That's why they elected Milei. We don't have to get too much into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I want to apply his 3 criteria for a successful regime change. I'll broaden it beyond a successful socialist regime change to Argentina here. His criteria are improves quality of life, replaces a worse regime, and there are no human rights catastrophes. I mean, all 3 of those apply to Milei taking over. The quality of life is going up. It definitely replaced a worse regime, and he hasn't committed any human rights catastrophes. I mean, and I do want to also touch on. You mentioned it there that there will be something rough. There will be like a rough patch when you introduce the capitalism. Basically, the reason for this is that under the previous socialist regime, this is basically Austrian business cycle theory, that you had a bunch of misallocation of resources. And then when you start getting the market in there, you're going to realize, okay, all of these things, they're in the wrong place. We got to deal with this. So the bust that you get is actually, that's a good thing. It is reallocating resources towards where they need to be. And it's like this sort of Keynesian myth that, oh no, we just got to keep the boom times going forever. But keeping the boom going is just further misallocating resources. I quite like this one analogy from a guy, can't remember his name right now. He works at the Mises Institute. He's done some lectures on the business cycle theory. Where basically it's like if you were Robinson Crusoe on the desert island, and one day you see like some mushrooms outside of your shack, and you eat those mushrooms, and they make you hallucinate in such a way that you believe you have a far greater stockpile of resources than otherwise. And so you start, instead of building like a tiny little raft, you start building like a massive fishing trawler. You start, instead of repairing the leaky hole in your roof, you build a mansion. And then, once the mushrooms wear off and you realize you don't have enough resources to even come close to finishing any of these, the Keynesian comes along and he says, well, just eat some more mushrooms and then you'll get those resources back. And you can keep going on with these projects. But the Austrian solution would be, no, you've misallocated those resources. See what you can salvage from this situation. Be a realist here.
Right. Like, you have in cases like this, a lot of people became dependent on the welfare programs because there's a lot of misallocation of resources. By the way, America spends a super fuck ton of money on welfare. That's our biggest expense. So this is a problem that's present in America, despite how socialists want to ignore how much money we spend on welfare. But all these people are dependent on welfare, right? And as a result, they are less productive. There is less social mobility. They're much less likely to rise out of poverty or just become richer in general. So what do you have to do to fix that? To make it to where they can actually become better off and aren't basically stagnant, or just if things are improving generally very slowly, you have to pull out the rug, and it's not going to be great. People are losing a bunch of things that they are depending on, but you have to do it if you want to actually fix things. It's just something you have to do, and because eventually something much worse is going to happen. That just kind of applies to practically all areas of the economy, especially the ones that are being boosted disproportionately by the government, which we'll actually come back to that shortly in like literally a few seconds here.
Gloat about how superior my ideology is. There's a lot of real people bearing the brunt of his stupidity. But aside from the obvious douchebaggery, oftentimes when socialist countries experience turmoil, it isn't even due to socialism. Venezuela is a great example. No, socialism did not destroy Venezuela. Dutch disease, along with other things, did.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, first of all, he's just like, nuh-uh. So, I mean, yeah, Dutch disease was a problem. The central planners engaged in Dutch disease, and they were able to do so because there was central planning. Basic argument here is, oh, we want socialism, but when the people in charge of the socialism do something stupid, then it's not socialism. Only socialism when they do things perfectly.
Yeah, it's like, surely this massive influx of resources, if socialism is better at allocating resources than capitalism, it should be able to deal with this perfectly fine. But I mean, like, there have been times in capitalist countries, I'm sure you'll have specific examples, I could probably find some, where there's been like some brand new resource, super, you know, there's like a lot of hype around this resource, it generates a lot of income, and the capitalist economy deals with it fine. I mean, like, you know, fucking Silicon Valley, right? Why didn't any of those capitalist countries undergo Dutch disease? But the socialists, they got it out the wazoo.
Yeah, and even if something kind of similar happens, where there's like a new resource and everybody's rushing towards that, it's usually not that many resources, or I should say, not that much capital being invested into it. Like, that's just not quite what happens. Oftentimes it ends up supporting a bunch of other industry, right? So like the gold rush, for example, supported a lot of other industry, and people were able to survive on other means as well. Like, you know, all these new businesses popped up, all these new routes popped up, stuff like that. Like, there wasn't this problem where there's this big gold rush and then people couldn't find gold anymore and then everything collapsed and everyone was poor. It doesn't happen like that, because I mean, entrepreneurs know not to invest all of their I mean, generally speaking, of course, like they do make mistakes. Entrepreneurs are not perfect, but you know, it's much faster to fix those mistakes. And because of the decentralization, you know, one entrepreneur isn't controlling an entire market, so they're not like screwing everything up for everybody. But generally speaking, entrepreneurs know not to invest, you know, not to put all their eggs in one basket, but socialists don't seem to know that.
Yeah.
Venezuela hitched its bets to its oil industry and failed to diversify its
Oh, and by the way, one of the reasons they were investing so much in the oil industry is because they wanted a bunch of money from it to fund their socialist welfare programs. So,
yeah.
Just saying.
Exports or properly nurture other economic sectors. Venezuela also suffered sanctions, corruption, and other economic devastation that had nothing to do with socialism. Successful.
All right, yeah. So, quick point on the sanctions thing. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Not sure exactly if this will work correctly, but we'll give it a shot. There it is. Okay, cool. All right, how's that?
Yeah, it's working.
All right, perfect. So, well, in regards to the sanctions arguments, I mean, there are some grounds you can argue against this, just where it's like universal, basically, right? Like you can kind of address it even if you don't know the specifics. In that case, I would point out that they're always saying how bad it is for these third world countries or global South to trade with the United States and the capitalist countries. They're all being exploited. Like I just gave an example of this on my TikTok the other day, where this guy was saying, "Oh, look, it was actually about Javier Milei." He's like, "Look, Javier Milei is signing all these agreements with the Western countries. He's exploiting them, and this is going to help profit." And then, like, shortly before that, he made a video about Cuba, and he's talking about how the embargo made them poor. I'm like, which one is it?
Yeah,
Don't
like
be
that.
both.
That's like the kind of the point, like, which interested me about this. Like, shouldn't they like sanctions because it stops all this capitalist exploitation and trade? But yeah, it's interesting to know that, yeah, they really do hate trade.
And they some of them do like the sanctions. Castro liked the embargo on Cuba, and he said it helped the revolution. And actually, one of the things Castro promised he'd do is cut off trade with the United States.
Mhm.
And then the United States did it for him, and he's like, okay, cool. And then he used it to stay in power. He's like, look, the United States is trying to kill all of you people. You know, they're trying to starve us to death, and I'm the one here saving us. Now, this is one of the reasons why we should oppose sanctions. I mean, not only are they violations of private property rights, but sanctions have kept socialism alive. I don't know where we would be today, you know, a counterfactual where we would be today if we never put sanctions on Cuba, never put sanctions on Venezuela and North Korea. But I would imagine we'd be in a much better place today because socialists, I mean, they're always coming up with excuses, but their biggest excuses would not be here. But in regards to like the specifics of the sanctions, even then they get a lot of stuff wrong. So with Venezuela, these sanctions were put into place August of 2017, right? So there were already reports coming out prior to August 2017. You can find these in Reuters and other places. There were reports coming out about how people were losing so much weight, losing like 20 pounds a year. People were going hungry. And this paper from the Brookings Institute actually goes over a lot of data like this. Like it talks about, let's see here, like looking at different imports of food. I mean, that's important. We're not going to look at stuff like that, but like this, for example, maximum number of daily calories that can be purchased with a minimum wage. You see this dropping far before sanctions right here. They also have things like infant mortality rate and stuff like that. And what you find is that these things were getting worse before the sanctions went into effect. And that's kind of what the paper is pointing out. And it's showing like what it says here, the bulk of the deterioration in all of these socioeconomic indicators analyzed occurred prior to the August 2017 sanctions. So this is actually a paper, they're actually rebutting another paper, and often these socialists will cite this one about Venezuela. And so this paper basically pretends that linear time is not real.
Yeah.
So let me stop sharing this real quick, and then we can get back over here.
There we go.
Successful socialist experiment number 1. Burkina Faso at the hands of Thomas Sankara. Sankara is a personal hero of mine. I could go on for hours about him, but for the sake of brevity, I won't fangirl this time. Sankara was born in 1949 in what is now known as Burkina Faso, but at the time it was a French colony called Upper Volta. Upper Volta was one of the poorest countries in West Africa. It was largely an agrarian society with low rates of productivity. It lacked significantly when it came to infrastructure. It had high levels of unemployment, low literacy rates, gender discrimination, and poor healthcare. To top it off, droughts and other environmental issues were prevalent, and due to underdeveloped infrastructure, they negatively impacted crop yields, which led to more poverty. Sankara, an anti-colonialist Marxist-Leninist, overthrew the existing regime in 1983, and one of his first decisions was to rename Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning land of upright men. Now I know what you might be thinking. What a sexist douche. Women lived there too, Thomas. He was actually based as hell when it came to gender discrimination. This little pamphlet is a copy of his 1987 Women's Day speech, where the central thesis is that the revolution could not prosper without the emancipation of women. He also prohibited both female genital mutilation.
Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on the natural disasters point, like all these droughts and everything. Like, I wonder what his explanation would be for why natural disasters in capitalist, or at least more capitalist areas, are way less disastrous. Why is there so much more development in these capitalist areas? And the answer is, of course, because they have capitalism.
Yeah, and the entire first section of this part, first section of this section, I guess, first half of this section, whatever you want to say, it's really just weird because he's like saying all this stuff. He doesn't give sources. I mean, he eventually gets to Wikipedia and Jacobin, the greatest sources ever. But he's just like, oh, look, Burkina Faso was really freaking bad. I mean, it really like, I mean, West Africa was not so great. But I mean, comparatively speaking, Burkina Faso was kind of like right in the middle, like literally right in the middle. So I mean, yeah, like West Africa was pretty poor and sucked and still does, to be honest. But like he's trying to make it sound like it was uniquely bad because, and then Sankara came in and fixed everything. Now, I mean, I think stopping forced marriages, that's great. Stopping female genital mutilation, that's great. Good. Okay, we're upholding property rights. That's kind of what we're doing here, right? Great. Good on him. That's not socialism though.
Yeah.
I mean, can a socialist hold some moral views? I mean, yeah, a socialist can be against rape. Socialist can be against forced marriage and genital mutilation, and if they do something to prevent that, I applaud them. But this is not an achievement of socialism.
Yeah. And it's like, but even broader beyond Burkina Faso, I just have never been even remotely moved by the claim that, well, Africa is so poor because of all this Western exploitation, which ended, decades and decades ago. Like, let's just take it on its face that, okay, well, I will accept for argument's sake that there was a bunch of Western exploitation and whatnot. Okay. Then why were they poor before the Western exploitation happened? Why were the Western European nations so able to exploit them? And, in many cases, raise the standard of living. How did that happen? If they were all golden before, and they had all these resources, and all they need is the material means, the resources, to be wealthy, why weren't they wealthy? Well, the answer is that they're poor because they have bad philosophy. They are choosing poverty. And this is a thesis that I'm actually working on for a video down the line. That these types of areas where you have this chronic poverty, just poverty for generation after generation after generation, the fundamental thing is that those people are choosing to be in poverty, and they're evil for it.
Yeah, and of course, there's also lots of other things, whether it be geography or whatever else, that's going to affect, if you're comparing like an African nation to the United States. Even if you're just internally comparing African nations, I mean, what you find today is that countries that engage more in friendly trade with countries like the United States, those are the richer ones. Those are the ones where the people are better off. So, I mean, it's kind of, you see the exact opposite of the trend they would predict. The African nations that attempt like be more like an autarky, the ones that try to go against the United States and like, oh, we're not going to trade with you anymore and stuff like that, they tend to be worse off. And then the ones who have nice friendly relations with the United States, with the West, where the people love the West and they're building businesses and they're trading, those are the more successful countries.
Mhm.
Very similar with South America as well, and in Asia. I mean, everywhere, everywhere
Yeah.
for that matter. But yeah,
and forced marriages. In addition to this, he built schools, water reservoirs, medical centers, raised the literacy rate, planted 10 million trees to combat desertification, vaccinated millions against meningitis, measles, and yellow fever, and for those who think socialism is an economically unsound theory, Sankara improved the economy and agriculture so drastically that within only 4 years, UN analysts declared the country food self-sufficient.
now this is the big thing I want to focus on here because this is like incredibly wrong. Like he has no idea what he's talking about here. So I'll talk about a few of the other little claims in a second, but this is the real important one because here he's really talking about socialism. He's actually talking about like agriculture. He's talking about the means of production and capital and stuff like that, as opposed to like the other things, which is welfare. That's something I can touch on in a second here. But let me share my screen again real quick. This is a paper in the journal African Affairs that I found because I wanted to read about this agrarian change. I wanted to read about the changes he made in agriculture. And when you actually check it out, what you find is that Sankara wasn't a very good socialist. So
I
the
did
economic
notice in
policies under
the
Sankara
in the quote that
resembled.
he brought up, it did mention that in some areas private holdings were increasing. So I wonder if this is the same thing.
Yeah, no, I don't know if it's the same source, but yeah, he didn't read the Wikipedia page either. Um, but so the policies resembled the approach advocated for by the World Bank. So like kind of like the Washington Consensus, which is generally pretty good. It's definitely not perfect. It's like kind of neoliberal if you want to use that term. It's not like based on Austrian economics or it's certainly not anarcho-capitalism, but it's much better than something like the Beijing Consensus, socialism or whatever. And countries get much better off when they adhere to the Washington Consensus as opposed to socialism, because it's actually based on capitalism. But drastic budget reductions, cuts in pay and number of employed in public administration, a general reduction in deficits, an upward shift in agricultural producer prices, an appeal to private sector investors to engage in new productive investment. Roughly speaking, something like 3/4 of the World Bank's recommendations were met by Sankara without any World Bank intervention. So like they're always talking about how awful the World Bank stuff is, the Washington Consensus. And yeah, I mean, some of it is awful. But I'm just saying they're talking about how awful it is all the time, especially the capitalist policies specifically. And then they praise Sankara for doing exactly what the World Bank recommended.
Mhm.
So this is actually a great capitalist success in agriculture because like it was very feudal. It was socialist in some ways. Like it was a complete mess, their agricultural sector, and then they basically liberalized it.
Yeah, I am
And
also
I have
I am just also interested in the measure of economic success he's using is food self-sufficiency. Like, as if that is, like, the metric to look at.
yeah, I mean, there's different metrics you can look at. I don't. Yeah, you're right. I don't know about that one specifically. I mean, I would say things did improve overall in the agricultural sector. I think there is evidence for that, but again, it wasn't because of socialism. So like right here, I have from the VDEM Institute. They have metrics of state ownership of the economy, and this might throw some people off. So it's going up. This line's going up. So down here you see number one is most valuable capital either belongs to the state or is directly controlled by the state. For very little capital, very little valuable capital belongs to the state. So up means less socialism. Down means more socialism, right? So Sankara is in power in the 80s. What do you see happen in the 80s? A lot of socialism, right? Right? No, it's ridiculous. He just doesn't know what he's talking about. And by the way, let's while we're here, let's pull up Venezuela real quick. Um, Chavez comes to power in the 90s, and then Maduro later on around here. That looks like socialism to me. So I'm just saying. As far as the other things, I mean, yeah, he put a bunch of investment into a couple of particular areas. Was that a good thing to do? I mean, I would say probably not because it was central planning and he was neglecting many things. I mean, there's a lot of other drama you could get into here. There was like a lot of major teacher strikes, so on and so forth. But I mean, overall, this was a fairly uneventful, short term He was assassinated. Just he wasn't even in power. Best Marxist leader we've ever seen. That's like an extremely low bar, but yeah, I mean, things generally seem to improve, but it's because he wasn't a very good socialist.
Unfortunately, this story does not have a happy ending. Sankara was killed in a coup in 1987, and Burkina Faso regressed without him. Successful socialist experiment number 2, Jacobo Arbenz's Guatemala. In the 50s, an American business called the United Fruit Company had disproportionate control over the Guatemalan economy. They owned about 500,000 acres of land, ports, railroads, and more. This purchasing and appropriating of Guatemalan land forced the peasantry of Guatemala into a terrible quality of life. Through ostracizing the people of Guatemala from their own resource-rich lands and exploiting said lands for the financial gain of American big business.
This part's just complete nonsense. This is why this guy doesn't cite sources a majority of the time, and when he does, it's just little lines from Wikipedia. The United Fruit Company was the best thing to ever happen to countries like Guatemala ever. It was incredibly they came in, bought a bunch of land from people. I mean, oh no, scary buying land. Gave people thousands of jobs, built infrastructure, developed the economies they were in quite a bit. He doesn't really have any actual like proof otherwise, and he doesn't have an argument as to why it would be the case that the company coming in would impoverish people. Like that doesn't even make any sense.
Hmm. It's also interesting that he said this company came in and exploited the lands for the resources. It's like, okay, so then would he prefer that the resources just be left in there and they don't take any of the resources and use them for anything? Because then, like, okay, let's imagine the socialist counterfactual. His ideal socialist system for whatever country this is, Ecuador or something. I don't know. They go in and they say, okay, nobody's allowed to take any of the food from the trees on the land, and we'll all starve. Like, okay, great environmentalist, horrible humanitarian.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's nothing really no real points being made here. Just to finish off this little section right here when we're talking about United Fruit Company. I mean, there's quite a lot of empirical evidence about how important the investments were in terms of like living standards. Again, lots of jobs, infrastructure built. So you saw people in areas close to the United Fruit Company are less likely to be poor. They had better incomes overall. Let me see here. They were more luminous at night, so there's more infrastructure, more development. They have more electricity, so on and so forth. I really recommend checking out this little article. It's based on a paper that they published in Econometrica. It's really handy because United Fruit Company does come up a lot. Also, Lou Rockwell has a really good article about United Fruit Company on the Mises Institute website. I suggest people read that, and you'll be better prepared for when people bring up the United Fruit Company as if it's like a huge slam dunk.
Business, the United Fruit Company played its role in exacerbating wealth inequality in the country. Unfortunately, this is a story that is not all too uncommon in the global south, yet in the imperial core, we always find a way to demonize the people who choose to do something about the situation we've imposed upon them. Jacobo Arbenz is one of those people. Democratically elected Arbenz knew that he had to do something about the way that American big business was destroying the country, so he purchased the land back and redistributed it to the people of Guatemala. By 1954, a sixth of the population had received land due to Arbenz's reform law, formerly known as Decree 900. This legendary agrarian reform program not only resulted in higher living conditions for many farmers and their families, but it stuck up to big corporate imperialist bullies, told them that Latin America is not their playpen, and proved to be influential across the continent. The American
Okay. Man. This guy's so annoying. Okay, so Arbenz was a self-proclaimed capitalist. I mean, in his inaugural speech, if he actually bothered to go read it, he literally says he wants to turn Guatemala into a developed capitalist nation. He wasn't in power for very long at all. There wasn't a lot done. One of the only things he did was this decree 900. And it was very akin to socialism. It was a lot of redistribution of wealth. By the way, it wasn't all purchased. So he does the whole expropriating thing when it's a capitalist company purchasing things. But when it's the government expropriating things, he said it was all purchased. So he kind of flipped everything there. Also didn't give any evidence that this decree worked. He just asserted it did. But no, this was a catastrophic failure. It did not improve living standards. It completely screwed up their agricultural sector, their agricultural exports. This is just complete nonsense. I don't know why he thinks this. Again, Arbenz was not an explicit socialist. Like, this was the only semi-socialist thing they did. I don't know. Maybe you could say this was quite explicitly socialist. But he just doesn't know what he's talking about.
I think one point we could touch on there, just related to you saying, I don't know why he believes this. Do you think that in general, these socialists, these communists, who like bring up this type of example and then are constantly refuted on it, do you think that they actually believe what they're saying, or are they just lying and propagandizing?
In the case of this guy, I mean, this is rather simple stuff. You know, I think there are certain things where it seems much more like they're lying. You know, when they're defending more extreme things or things that it's quite easy to find evidence on. You know, like if they're saying, "Oh, the Holodomor never happened," or something like that. With stuff like this is much more simplistic. He probably just saw it in a meme and assumed it's true. Now, I think they definitely, you know, bear some responsibility there. You know, just sharing something without verifying that it's true. And to be fair, there's mixed scholarship on this. It's just that the more up-to-date scholarship that responds to the existing scholarship that says this was something that was successful. I forgot where I was going with that. The point is, there is up-to-date scholarship that demonstrates that this was a catastrophic failure. And you would expect it to be. You know, you don't just hand a bunch of people a bunch of agricultural land and expect them to now handle it as well as the bigger companies and plantations were. I mean, that's just a silly assumption to make.
Yeah, and it's like, on this point of, this guy has like no sources aside from just Wikipedia screenshots and like Jacobin articles. It's like night and day between this guy's video, at least this one, and like, you know, I'll scroll through your TikTok sometimes, and it's like every like 3 seconds I'll see like a source pop up over your chest or something. It's like, okay, yeah, he's citing some paper here. Like in my videos, there's all these footnotes everywhere. Like, I mean, you know, why even bother citing all these sources if you can get away with just having a Wikipedia screenshot?
Yeah, did you see that video that was went viral on Twitter where the guy was like doing all this LARPing and talking about China and the Soviet Union and Cuba and like acting the stuff out, and then he was just slamming walls of text on screen.
Yeah.
Like, oh, the Chinese communists, they did this and this and this and this, and not a single source in sight.
Yeah, they just say shit.
So
they just say
people
shit.
Sent me like fucking. They just say shit. People were sending me death threats in my DMs because I made fun of him for not putting any sources. And I kept asking people to give sources, and like not a single person actually provided one that backed up the exact statistics that he gave. Like, they gave stuff that was making generally the same dumb arguments, and I responded to them and pointed out why they were wrong. But like, nobody was even able to present the same data. Like, where did he get it? No one was able to reproduce it. You know, it's It's just such nonsense. I can't stand these people. And yeah, you're right. Like I put all this effort, and sometimes I'm like, why do I even do this? A few times I've done things where I just didn't give sources and I made the crazy claims, and then I just get flooded with, source, where's your proof of this? I'm like, bro, I always have it. And, and then you guys never hold the same standards with the socialists when they say this not, or when they have a source that contradicts them. Sometimes it contradicts them on screen, like that guy, like this guy with Thomas Sankara. It's so ridiculous. I'm not gonna get too much more into the agrarian reform. Overall point is, it started in 52. It was stopped in 54. Not that much even happened per se. There's a great paper about it by Douglas Refsker. Relatively easy to find. So if anybody wants to go read into it, it's in the International Social Science Review. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this because again, like Arbenz was like really like anti-socialist. I mean, we can say from our perspective he was kind of socialist, but from the socialist perspective, he really was not.
Subsequently funded, launched, and orchestrated the coup that exiled Arbenz. This CIA operation.
Also, a funny note here. If you look at, like, I was looking at Arben's Wikipedia page, and then I was like clicking on his successors and their successors. I was like, wow, some of these people were just in power for a couple months. It's because there was like a bunch more coups and assassinations that happened right after this. It's just such a mess. But you know, it's terrible that people had to go through this, but it's kind of funny just like clicking through and seeing, oh, his successor in power for 2 days, and then he's assassinated, and then he's in power for 4 days, and then he's blown up, and it's just kind of funny.
Was called PB Success if you want to read more about it. But there was a certain individual who was living in Guatemala at the time, and he happened to witness all of this and take inspiration from Arbenz and his policies, and that individual was Che Guevara. Successful socialist experiment number 3, Salvador Allende's Chile. Now this case is one that I think is very nuanced, but I firmly believe that Allende's Chile, when all was said and done, was a successful implementation of socialist policies, and I'll explain why. Salvador Allende was a democratically elected socialist who nationalized mines, telephone lines, and more in Chile. His socialist policies raised the quality of life for many Chileans, helped the country fight back against inflation that was ravaging not only the country, but most of the continent. He lowered unemployment, and he helped create the Chilean National Health Service, which was the first program in the Americas to guarantee universal health care. All of these achievements occurred within the first year of his presidency and proved how quickly good policy could turn a country around. Now, if you can sense a
Well, hold on.
That's what I was about to say. But
He didn't prove that it turned the country around. He just said, "Oh, he implemented all these policies," and that proves how quickly a country. Like, no. Like, where's your criteria, bro? You gave us 3 criteria: like, improves quality of life, replaced worse regime. Like, apply them. Show us, according to your criteria, this improved the quality of life. Like, he hasn't.
He just mentioned inflation and unemployment. But this is, it's so crazy when I hear people say this, like, oh, Salvador Allende improved wages and increased inflation, blah, 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 because that's not what happened. But this guy, to give him some credit, acknowledges this in a second here. So let's just go over that. This all happened the first year, all right? But we're talking, he was almost in power almost 3 years.
But coming in my delivery, you would be right. Allende's socialist policies were working well until the second year of his term. American intervention in Chile became so aggressive and overbearing that it's hard to believe any country, socialist or not, would be able to hold its own. The American government and American economists, namely Milton Friedman, did whatever they could to meddle with the Chilean economy. Friedman was a notorious economist who promoted economic theories of mass privatization, defunding social programs, and overall hypercapitalism. He was one of
Based.
Hypercapitalism. Good trick.
Yeah, wait until he hears the
economics at
kind of
the
capitalism we
Americans
advocate.
launched the Chile Project in the 50s with the goal of turning Chile into a massive neoliberal experiment. Many Chileans, now known as the Chicago Boys, were brought to Chicago to study under Milton Friedman. When those Chicago boys returned home, and when Allende, who threatened to nationalize U.S. copper mines, became president, both the U.S. government and the indoctrinated Chicago boys fueled domestic flames, leading to lockouts, strikes, and boycotts. These lockouts were promoted heavily by the Nixon administration with the goal to halt the Chilean economy. Local business owners, truckers, and other Chileans, in an attempt to spite Allende, would withhold their products or mark them up unnecessarily to artificially demean the economy. In addition to this, copper, which was Chile's biggest export, was not only suffering a drop in price, but there was a reluctance to purchase Chilean copper due to America's disapproval of the country. Things like
Okay. Well, let's kind of go back here a little bit. Let's give a little context on some of this data. And this is going to explain exactly why he's saying some of this nonsense. Here. So this is Market Socialist and Mixed Economies by Romeo Mesalago. He's an economist. Not really one of ours guys. He's a very like Keynesian socialist leaning, but he's very objective. I'll say that about him. He's not some crazy ideologue. So, and he's really good with the data, economic history, and stuff like that. So, all right, here, real wages increased by 21.5 points in 1971 because of government control, and a 12.8% drop of inflation. But in 1972, they declined by 12.4 points and by 41.1 points more in 1973. So initially you saw some improvement, but then things drastically switched around. This is because it's easy. It's really easy in central planning to make these improvements in the short term. Like it's not hard to say, oh, the minimum wage is $100 now. And now real wages are going to be really high or a little bit until it catches up with you. Inflation went down initially, then it went up and went higher than it had ever been, about 1,000% under Allende. Insane, absolute insanity. Right here, real wages decreased by 53% from 1970 to 1973. That's Salvador Allende's legacy, and that's why he's trying to blame it on Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman didn't do this. How did he do that? That doesn't make any sense.
Don't you know how he did it? He indoctrinated the Chicago boys. They're indoctrinated, and so they can't think for themselves. So they went back there and they just, I guess they were also the dictators, so they could decide how the economy would run.
The economists with absolutely no power somehow destroyed the economy for some reason. Monetary supply increased 30 times. Wow, 30 times in 3 years. That's insane. And look at these tariffs. Average tariff of 94%, maximum of 600%. He's like, oh, they didn't want to trade with Chile. Yeah, I wonder why. They went in, they stole a bunch of foreign-owned businesses and foreign-owned capital. It slapped on huge tariffs. And then they're like, oh, why won't you guys trade with us? Why won't you guys give us credit? That did not happen because Nixon made it happen. It did not. That happened completely naturally. And yeah, that did screw them over in some ways, but that's because of their own doing. You can't create an economy that is aggressive against private capital and then complain that private capital won't come near you.
Yeah, I bet you he's going to right after this be like, and then the evil capitalist Pinochet came in. Pinochet, by the way, he would end up nationalizing those copper mines. So, be interesting to see if he calls him a capitalist on that.
He'll bring up. I think he brings up Pinochet briefly. I don't exactly recall. I have a, but we'll deal with that. Now. They do a little cope here because the U.S. never put in any official policy regarding embargo or sanctions. Not like Cuba, or whatever. Here, let me pull up another one quick. See. So there's something called the invisible blockade. That's what they call it. It's a total cope because it wasn't a blockade. It's like it was an invisible blockade. This is a really great blog post, just tearing through this myth. And this is another like kind of like left-wing-ish guy, and he absolutely tears this apart. But I mean, he points out that there were other countries that opened up credit to Chile, like the Soviet Union, for example. They gave a bunch of aid to Chile, and there's a lot of other copes about this. Like they talk about the U.S. was going to dump all of its copper holdings, and that would screw over Chile. This didn't actually happen until '73, and Kissinger pointed out that U.S. stockpile was only 3% of the world's annual production. It wasn't even really going to make that much of a difference, and it didn't. So, if anyone wants to like get into the nitty and gritty of this, I really recommend this article because it kind of just tears that apart. This guy barely even makes any arguments to this regard, so I'm not going to worry about rebutting arguments he didn't make. I'm just throwing this out there for anyone interested.
By the way, turn left. This is in chat now. He wants us to do the other video. But we're doing one of the videos in the thumbnail already. So afterwards.
We've already been up here for over an hour. I'm not sure if we'll have time to do the other. I didn't think it would take this long, but I guess
we'll see. We'll see.
Like this always make me wonder if socialism is such a bad idea from the get-go and it's doomed to fail. Then why does the West constantly feel the need to intervene and spend billions of dollars or kill millions of people to make sure that it fails? I thought it was doomed from the jump. Why would Nixon need to give the direct order, and I quote, "make the economy scream," when referring to what he wanted to see done about Allende's Chile? I thought this shit was supposed to crumble on its own. Long story short, September 11th, 1973.
Of course, a quick comment on that. Nixon was not an Austrian economist. Nixon was president during the Cold War, fighting with the Soviet Union indirectly. I mean, Chile was a hotbed of the Cold War. Salvador Allende was backed by the Soviets from the beginning. They helped fund his campaign. They were paying him off while he was president. And again, they were giving him extra credit. They gave him a huge line of credit. They're actually sending a bunch of tanks and shit over to Chile. There was a boat on the way, and I think the coup actually happened while the boat was on the way, and then it was redirected. So the Soviet Union was like fully backing them, and also I'll briefly mention that Allende was a total dictator. Like he was absolutely shredding their constitution, and you can look up the Declaration of the Breakdown of Chile's Democracy, where the Congress was pointing out like all this stuff and pointing out that he was turning into a total dictator and undermining their constitution. So like really, the dictatorship that Augusto Pinochet had was inherited. Not that he wasn't a dictator himself. I'm not saying that. I'm saying like a dictatorship was already established. Now, does that mean he wouldn't have established a dictatorship? I don't know. But there was a dictatorship already established by Salvador Allende, and very clearly so, if you actually look at the evidence presented in the declaration that I mentioned.
Allende was killed in a coup and replaced by a military junta, which then devolved into the right-wing dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. Now, you would think that since the pesky socialist was out of the equation, the economy would boom under Pinochet, especially since one of his economic advisors was the great Milton Friedman, one of the thought leaders behind neoliberal capitalism. But no, The opposite happened, actually. I'm going to read you a few lines from one of my favorite books, The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. In 1982, despite its strict adherence to Chicago Doctrine, Chile's economy crashed. Its debt exploded, it faced hyperinflation once again, and unemployment hit 30%, 10 times higher than it was under Allende. The only thing that protected Chile from a complete economic collapse in the early 80s was that Pinochet had never privatized Codelco, the state copper mine company nationalized by Allende. That one company generated 85% of Chile's export revenues, which meant that when the financial bubble burst, the state still had a steady source.
And that's sad. I wish the state didn't have a source of funds.
Yeah.
A few things. I love how she said hyperinflation came back. I wonder when hyperinflation was there before. Hyperinflation was not as bad under Pinochet, by the way. It was not 1,000. It was really bad under Allende. It was pretty bad under Pinochet. I mean, hyperinflation is always really bad. Us in the West and like the United States, we can't even comprehend how bad hyperinflation is. Like, it's actually horrific for a person to have to go through that. It just destroys you.
Yeah,
Destroys
there's
your
no
mind, your
future-oriented planning
personality.
that can happen.
Exactly. Joe Salerno has an entire paper about this, about how hyperinflation destroys the human spirit. It's really depressing, actually. But anyways, so 1982, yeah, a big recession happened. But he says this is because, or Naomi Klein says this is because he was closely adhering to the Chicago School, but this is not true. A big problem here was they got off of a free floating exchange rate, and they had a fixed exchange rate, i.e. central planning, extra central planning. And Friedman had recommended a free floating exchange rate, and the general consensus of the Chicago School is to have a free floating exchange rate. So that was definitely not caused by the Chicago School, and they still had not, like, I mean, she points it out right here, like, they still had to nationalize copper mines, right? They still had not gone through all of their phases of liberalization at this point. They're going quite slowly up to this point, actually. In the first couple of years, barely any changes happened, and they ran more on a Keynesian model. Really, the big changes didn't happen until after 82. And after 82, you see things improve massively. Even more so after Augusto Pinochet left power and Chile became more of a democracy rather than a dictatorship. Things improved even faster. So yeah, this is just again like random little points out of context, and they don't actually dig into, what's actually going on here.
Source of funds. So not only were Allende's policies preferable to Friedman's and Pinochet's, but Allende was literally saving the economy from beyond the grave. I'll leave you with a quote from a super normal and definitely not evil dude named Henry Kissinger. We didn't do it. I mean, we helped them. We created the conditions as great as possible. One argument I often hear from
Yeah, the coup. I mean, Kissinger was right here. They didn't. A lot of people have that misconception that basically the U.S. directly did the coup. It was definitely not direct. We did. I'm not gonna say we. I don't like saying we. When we're talking about the CIA, the State Department, they did try to facilitate. No, that actually goes a little back to like some of the strikes he was talking about. It's kind of annoying when they like talk about how important workers are in strikes and listening to strikes and unions, but when they happen under the socialist regimes, then suddenly they don't matter. Like he didn't even mention that when it came to Sankara. That was a big kind of contention under Sankara, the unions and the strikes. But like in this case, the strikes happened because of the hyperinflation and stuff like that. And then a lot of strikers went to the U.S. to get like help, to say, hey, can you substitute our incomes while we're striking? And the U.S. to some extent helped them. Not really a lot, but to some extent helped them. And sure, I mean, you can say that helped the strikes carry on. But like, they were still strikes.
Yeah, it's like shouldn't the socialists like normally they normally love strikes, like when the US likes it, I guess not.
Yeah, he tries to kind of frame it like it's capitalist striking. That's really not the case. It was mostly workers. Like there was a lot of strikes that happened. And you see that the strikes were increasing before they were being funded. Actually, that article I referenced a little while ago about the invisible blockade, he kind of goes over the date on that. They were happening before they were actually receiving U.S. funding, or the U.S. was encouraging the strikes in any way. The U.S. just kind of latched on to that, or the State Department, CIA, they latched on to something that was already happening. I would say like even Kissinger probably like overestimates the role that the U.S. played. Because like if you are really looking into information that we have after the fact, like information from Chile internally, what you find is that the military, they were definitely like all for doing this just based off of the way the economy was going and the way Allende was violating the Constitution. So it's it probably, if the U.S. had stayed out completely, it still would have happened. But there's no real way of knowing. Either way, the coup was a good thing, I would say.
Hmm.
Yeah, you can clip me on that. I'm not gonna take that back. I've said that for years.
There you go.
Anti-socialists is, well, if ex-socialist country can be destroyed by sanctions, embargoes, and Western intervention, then socialism is to blame because it created a weak and susceptible country. This line of logic is idiotic. The West has sanctioned non-socialist countries in the past, and they have also suffered similar economic troubles. But to make an ethical argument here, I don't think it's right to blame
but
a
why?
sovereign, developing socialist
just
or neoliberal country
latch onto that for a
being
second.
stifled by the large power and
Like, why would any country on the socialist economics, the Marxian theory, why would any country suffer under sanction? It should flourish under sanction, because no longer can the foreign capitalists exploit that country. It should reduce the level of exploitation so that people can reap more of their labor value. Like, why would that ever happen? Right? This only works. This analysis only works if you accept capitalism. Like, I don't get it.
Yeah, unequal exchange only works if there's exchange. So, like, hey, we're helping you, right? Which, I mean, we both can recognize that. I mean, yeah, the sanctions were harmful. The sanctions were harmful for Venezuela, for sure. I was pointing out that they didn't, like, all those problems didn't originate from the sanctions. Sanctions certainly worsened them, and that paper I cited even said this. Embargo worsened things for Cubans, particularly after the 90s, because, I mean, prior to that, they were trading with other nations like the Soviet Union. But in the 90s, of course, the Soviet Union fell, and so things were quite bad for them. And Cuba would be much better off for sure if we lifted the embargo. Without a doubt, it would be better off. But it would still have a lot of problems stemming from the socialist economy. We still saw that abundantly, during this long period where they were trading with the Soviet Union, and not only that, but the Soviet Union was giving them way more money. And Castro admitted this too, and this is also covered in that book I cited, talked about Chile. He talks about Cuba as well. They were giving Cuba way more money than the U.S. was. So you'd think, if this is all hinging on trade, that Cuba would have been flourishing during this period from like 1961 to 1991, but that was not the case.
Of course, we're just stuck on using bourgeois logic, where there are sound inferences, and things are what they are, and we just need to think more proletarian, and then we'd understand how stopping capitalist exploitation is also not socialist.
Did you just use deduction instead of saying the word material in front of every seventh word?
We need to apply a dialectic to this.
Whenever I hear somebody like randomly say like material conditions, I'm like, Because nobody else says that. We say quality of life or something like that. Material. I don't even know. Like, why do you guys? Why can't you guys just say quality of life or something? It's so
Yeah.
annoying. Like, you need to look at the material content. You need to make a material analysis. I'm like, bro, you can make the same point without saying material all the time. I mean, it's always the noobs too. It's always the people who don't actually know Marxism. If you talk to like well-read Marxists, they do not talk like that.
Yeah.
That's the Marxists that learn everything from TikTok. Oh, I mean, this part's great. This part's so
and its
great.
embargoes, sanctions, or coup d'etats. In stark contrast to all of these aforementioned examples of what I consider to be successful socialist experiments, I can list a great many failed capitalist societies. One could make the argument that America, being the richest country in the world where one of the primary causes of premature death is treatable illness, is not only a pragmatic and logistic
I can name a lot of countries that have failed from capitalism. For example, America, the richest country in the world.
And it's also like number one cause of death being treatable illness. How are we describing treatable here? Because basically every cause of death is potentially treatable. If you had like enough resources for it, but like compared to what? Right? Compared to in a lot of areas, even though US healthcare is massively state involved, like the insurance industry is horrible over in the US. That's why it costs so much. But like even then, you do get better outcomes for like I know off the top of my head that cancer outcomes are better in the US than they are in the UK with National Health Service. It's like what compared to what? Like I would suspect that it's probably the case in most places that preventable death is the number one cause of death. Because what would be an unpreventable death? It would be like, you know, if the moon is crashing into the earth. It would be like terminal illness. Like, most people don't die that way. They die in something which is preventable.
I mean, I think the moon crashing is preventable. You just let this guy blow hot air at it, and then it'll put people on away. I mean, that's like roughly
but
it.
a moral abomination. That's all from me. If you like the video,
yeah.
I don't like the video. I'm gonna downvote it actually.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and access this on my account rather than through Discord, and I'm gonna dislike it. Yeah. Anyway, do you have time for the other video?
Maybe we could like. I think there may be some points I want to quickly make on that. Let's like put it on like 1.5 and go over a few parts of the beginning, and then maybe we can get back to it someday. I mean, she's talking about Russia and the Soviet Union. I've talked about this extensively on TikTok and YouTube, so maybe people can just run over and see stuff I've already done on that, or they can look at Nintil's. That's Nintil. Nintil's blog post about the Soviet Union. He's got several great articles. Just look at Nintil Soviet Union series. You'll find it. It's pretty easy. So you can touch on all these specifics on the USSR and like various myths about that. But there are a few like silly things that she says. It really annoy me. I don't know. People just don't do research. I wish they would just read books or read good books at least. Don't read fucking shock therapy or shock doctrine. You're not gonna learn anything from that.
Yeah, do you want to just like take a quick bathroom break?
Actually,
I gotta go take a piss before we start this.
I don't need to, but
Alright, I'll be right back.
I'll finish a point I was making. Viewers. So this is an interesting thing. So that book you referenced earlier about Chile, shock doctrine, it opens with Naomi Klein talking about Milton Friedman and New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. So right after Hurricane Katrina, Milton Friedman wrote maybe his last article, if not one of his last articles. I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, and he recommended bringing a charter program to schools in New Orleans to help them recover, and they actually did this. And Naomi Klein just like attacked it, and she attacked Milton Friedman for being too short, and just all this silly stuff being ridiculous, and like, oh, this is a total disaster, racial inequality, and the students are totally screwed because of neoliberal capitalism. But I mean, years later, we have analyses looking at the results of these reforms in New Orleans, and they were incredibly good. You saw grades improve, you saw graduation rates improve, college attendance rates improve, and even less racial gaps in outcomes. So like literally every single possible bad outcome that she predicted failed, all of them. Same with rich versus poor, not just the racial gaps, but rich and poor gaps. So they were quite successful.
Yo.
Hello.
Are you good to go?
Everybody's having like a debate about Chase Oliver in the comments, apparently. All right, let's check this out real quick.
Why are the vibes off? Am I insane? Why am I sad all the time? Why does everything feel bad? Why is everyone so mean and uncaring? I think they built the world wrong. I've been trying to figure out what's wrong with me since I was a kid. When I was 12, my obsession with learning about psychology, particularly about mental illness, began. I would take the personality disorder quiz on 4 degrees all the time, convincing myself that I had every single personality disorder possible because only that could describe just how
Imagine my shock.
up everything felt all the time. Even though you can't actually have every single personality disorder, so, like, obviously I didn't. Surely the problem was with me and my brain, I thought, not understanding that systemic issues lead to exactly what I was experiencing. I was deeply unsatisfied and frustrated, and I was honestly kind of a bit of a menace to society. But now that I know way more about history than I did as, like, a 12-year-old, I can see that my rage and sadness and the constant feeling that something was horribly wrong was not created in a vacuum. Something actually was horribly wrong. There wasn't something horribly wrong with me. I was responding rationally to irrational circumstances. I was born in a capitalist dystopia a year and a day after the illegal dissolution of the nation my parents called home, and everything just felt wrong. I didn't know why everything felt so wrong at the time, but now I know that it was because my parents and all the people who were alive in this nation just a year and a day before my birth experienced going from living in a country that provided free higher educations with an additional stipend if you had above a B average, housing with rents that were 3% of one's salary, a robust universal healthcare system, and workers' rights like the right to a guaranteed job in one's field, where unemployment and homelessness were basically unheard of and crime was low, to now living in a country where
Wait, can we pause there?
Market liberalization, unemployment,
Right to a job. I want to just quickly touch on that. Just on what it means to have a right to a job is that you have a right to enslave others to force them to work with you. So, and not having that, that's massively out of place. And a rational response to this, rational, that's another interesting word that she uses, is to be completely dysfunctional. The reason why I say rational is an interesting word to use is because socialists are against the use of the mind. So, what the hell is she even talking about?
Yeah, I didn't watch this entire video in advance, because I didn't know we were actually going to respond to it today initially. I just kind of watched the beginning, so I actually don't know which country she's talking about right here. If she's just saying the Soviet Union or she's talking about a Soviet nation, but she refers to like the illegal dissolution, and they say this a lot because they don't know what they're talking about. Like when she's talking about reading history, lady, memes aren't history. Let's be real. Come on. If you read history, what you find is that they had this referendum and people generally wanted to have a new union, like a new union of these countries, but this entailed the countries having a lot more sovereignty than they did prior. So it was not going to be the same Soviet Union. It's going to be very different. Also, people were a lot more like anti-socialist at this point, and they were not going to have socialist economies. They're already all going towards liberalization. It's already happening. And actually, several countries refrained from engaging in this referendum. They don't mention that, like Georgia and Estonia, for example. It's just 2 of them. And then, after this was decided, the reason they went back on it is because a bunch of radical communists tried to do a coup, called the August coup, in August of 1991. And they don't talk about stuff like that. Like, the communists came in and just caused havoc. And because of that, people lost trust in having this socialist government. And then all these individual countries started having their own referendums, and the citizens overwhelmingly voted for independence. And then these countries are leaving, right? Like, over 90% of Georgians voted for independence. Over 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence. So this is just complete nonsense. They completely ignore all of these additional referendums that happened after the first one.
Homelessness and crime rapidly skyrocketed as people lost their guaranteed jobs and guaranteed housing. Rents and housing prices skyrocketed. The life expectancy for men dropped by 4 years over the course of 2 years. Some people who kept their jobs didn't get paid for months, and the healthcare system went from robust universal healthcare to now being able to choose between expensive privatized healthcare and bad quality public healthcare. All because the people in charge didn't listen to the will of the voting people, 77.85% of whom voted to maintain this previously
Hold on. She said the choice between public health care. No, she said it turned from public health care into the choice between high quality private or low quality public, but she didn't mention the quality of the previous public health care.
It wasn't very good, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why the Soviet Union fell. Things weren't exactly great at this point. And that's not to say that things got worse, because but there's several reasons to that. I can get into that in a second. But yeah, I mean, it's just throwing stuff out there. It would be nice to at least have like citations for this. You know, I mean, I know some of the stuff she's saying is true because I'm familiar with it, but this is kind of the same lazy thing where they just say stuff and you have to believe it.
Apparently the country she's talking about is Poland, by the way.
No. No way. That's crazy. That's so stupid. I was just talking about Poland earlier. Nah, that's ridiculous. Okay. Yeah.
Socialist system, the one that my parents were born into.
What a moron.
And yes, the system had problems. The working conditions weren't always the best, as there was no occupational safety and health administration equivalent. Workplaces may have been worker run, but some of them had very strict rules about ridiculous things like being on time. There were frequent shortages, including food shortages. You had to wait in line for seemingly everything because of the shortages, but it was stable. The system at least ensured that you were never left without a job, without help.
Yeah, no, so if she's talking about Poland, all of this was happening before the reforms. This is such bullshit. These massive shortages and lines, that was happening before the reform. That's the reason they put in the reforms. This is complete bullshit. Like, I mean, yeah, those stuff existed after the reforms, but like, she's acting like it was literally a utopia and suddenly everything was good. And let's not forget, like, how Poland got under this system in the first place. Like, hello? Come on. Did Poland do an independence referendum? I'm not familiar with that. I don't know the specifics of Poland actually gaining. I'm gonna have to. I would have brushed up on that if I realized she was talking about Poland. But again, I didn't really watch it before.
That's fair.
Health, you were free from so many terrible things. Free from poverty, free from homelessness, free from unemployment, freedoms a lot of us in the West have never truly experienced, because the threats of all those things are always there. And it didn't purport to be perfect, especially because a system can never be perfect. Building a system is an iterative process. It had many.
It didn't have any of the problems we had. Everything was awesome and perfect. It wasn't perfect though.
Yeah, she's saying like free from poverty, but also that there are a bunch of, you had to wait in line for food and everything. That doesn't sound free from poverty. I don't have to do that.
Give me 1 second. I'm gonna go grab a book I have. Stats in it.
Sure. I'll just, in the meantime, bloviate on this topic. Like, I hate all these free froms that the socialists like to use. Real freedom is when you're free from poverty. So freedom means that you enslave all the capitalists to work for you, and then you end up in poverty because those capitalists can no longer use their mind, they can no longer produce, right? So free from poverty means that you have to get into poverty. I hate this type of thing. It's just completely and utterly backwards. Everything they say on this topic. Freedom means slavery. Fucking George Orwell was completely right with these type of bumper sticker slogans that he likes to use. It is insanity.
All right, here's some interesting things about Poland. All right, so 1989, it's one of the poorest countries in Europe. Like I was saying earlier, very poor country. You're making less than $50 a month, which is a tenth, not even a tenth of what people were making in West Germany. And even taking into account like purchasing power and stuff like that, they were making significantly less than even their peers, even their communist peers. Poland was lagging behind them. There was a lot of chronic shortages in 88 and 89. I don't know where she gets this information. I mean, she was a child when this was happening.
She doesn't know where she gets it from either, because she hasn't included any fucking sources.
You know, I actually wanted to check out this video because I mean, I thought it was going to go an entirely different direction. It still might go that way. I saw the very first thing she put in her description was a link to an article on the CIA's website about Joseph Stalin, and I thought this was going to be a whole like defending Joseph Stalin thing, which I guess she'll get to that eventually. I mean, she had to have that link there for a reason, right?
Mm.
But I don't know. This is a super goofy. But I mean, the book I grabbed, it's How Nations Escape Poverty by Rainer Zeitelman. He's got a whole chapter about Poland that goes over a lot of data on them becoming socialist, and then towards the end there, and then like the results of their reforms. If anybody wants to check that out, it's like really extensively sourced, unlike this video we're watching.
Yeah, someone actually mentioned Zeitelman in the chat there.
Oh, nice.
Them, albeit slowly. For example, this place criminalized homosexual acts between men in 1933 and then hosted the Gay and Lesbian Symposium and Film Festival in the summer of 1991. There were even doctors who provided gender-affirming care for trans people as early as the 1960s. I mean, the whole homophobia thing was a massive contradiction for this place, but it seemed to be going in a positive direction in the late 80s and early 90s with the hosting of the Queer Film Festival, creating guidelines around gender-affirming care, and allowing gay rights groups to assemble and publish and distribute gay newspapers. Plus, it's not like there were any other nations that had fantastic queer rights at that particular point in time anyway. Despite its many contradictions, the majority of people found the system to be pretty decent.
Worse?
Like I said, 77.85% of voters.
She's just saying like the people who voted in the referendum here, which again did not include all the countries, and that's not. She's not focusing on like Poland, for example. What were the results for Poland for the referendum? That's something that would be interesting to pull up.
Mm. Of course, she's doing this whole bit where she doesn't mention the country yet, so I suppose she can't have any sources, and then it's all okay.
Maybe she is just saying like the Soviet Union was a country. In which case, like, I mean, who said it was Poland?
Just a bunch of people in my chat were saying, oh, she's talking about Poland here. Yeah, Sude was saying she checked and it was about Poland. I guess we'll see.
This, you know, I'm not even, was Poland even a part of the 91 referendum? I don't even know if Poland was. Like,
I guess we'll find out. Maybe we'll be surprised and she's talking about somewhere else completely.
But like, if she's bringing up the referendum, I don't think Poland was part of the referendum because. Wait, am I tripping balls right now? When did Poland leave? I bet it's more likely she is the Soviet Union. This was June 4th, 1989. What a. All right, you know, I'm not gonna say any words that will get your channel banned, but you can fill the blank. What a dishonest, terrible person. If she's talking about Poland and she's bringing up the referendum where they didn't even get a vote in that because they had already left the Soviet Union. I wonder what the voting was on leaving the Soviet Union, though. Democratic revolutions of 1989. I don't think there was any sort of. Oh yes, there was. There was Poland Solidarity Trade Union won an overwhelming victory in partially free elections, leading to the peaceful. So they voted against the communists in the election. What a brainlet!
And then she's saying they didn't listen to the will of the people.
That's so gross, honestly. Like that's just gross. That like taking a shower after hearing this nonsense. So vile.
Wanted to maintain it, which makes sense because of course people like systems that keep them fed, employed, and housed and provide them access to good healthcare and education, even if they have flaws. And then on December 26, 1991, a year and a day before I was born, the stability of the system disappeared forever, almost overnight. An extremely educated population had their stability and security swiftly stolen from them. Even an advanced degree from a top-tier institution didn't guarantee they could get a job, especially if you were a woman. Whereas just
apparently
15 to
it's
30
not
years
Poland.
prior, women received 67% of all chemistry degrees, 45% of all math degrees, 40% of all
Poland?
engineering
What
degrees, and
country is
62%
it
of all
then?
economics and law
Russia.
degrees. Now many of those degrees were worthless as the
Well, that's what I was thinking originally, that it was going to be Russia. Who said? Why were people saying Poland then?
Someone else in their comments is Polish. And making the same points, I guess.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, Russia is still not the Soviet referendum that was multiple countries. So the point still stands overall. I don't know the specifics of how Russians voted in, but the other countries were voting for independence from, essentially independence from Russia. So I think that's still just as gross. That she's like, oh look, they were broken up after all these countries were voting for independence from Russia, as if like Russia was supposed to keep them enslaved to it.
Yeah.
the men over women, because suddenly, despite the fact that just a few days ago equality between women and men was enshrined in the Constitution, a woman's place was now in the home. Suddenly, workplaces were able to advertise roles like looking for female secretary between the ages of 22 and 26, preferably unmarried, because women were no longer regarded as equals, which also explains why domestic violence increased after that point. As market liberalization commenced, formerly worker-owned enterprises were rapidly privatized and snatched up by new oligarchs. Many workplaces were immediately liquidated, which meant a lot of people lost their jobs, and every single worker went from having a say over how their workplace runs to suddenly being beholden to the private individuals who owned the enterprise. There were no longer meetings to decide the company's goals democratically. Now a single person got to decide that without any worker input. Work went from being a social good that people did to improve society and to build solidarity.
That's not how it worked, by the way. The only country that had that was Yugoslavia. So unless she's talking about Yugoslavia.
I mean, who knows? Because she's
This
6
is
minutes
just
in and not
nonsense.
mentioning the country.
Yeah, like that's
To being something you did to create shareholder value and to stay
Annoying.
alive. Clearly, I was born into a world full of sad people who just had their futures, livelihood, stability, autonomy, and financial security ripped away from them. So,
That's
of course,
not the
the
name of
vibe
the
was
country.
completely off. I'd be sad too if I were them. In fact, I'm sad about all of that even now. My parents were young when this happened. My mom was 23 and my dad was 24. My mom hadn't made her way into the workforce yet, but had a position at a research lab lined up after graduation. The illegal dissolution of the nation my parents called home halfway through my mom's last year of graduate school ripped that opportunity away from her as scientists and engineers were quickly laid off since state-sponsored research was no longer a priority. My dad went from working on nuclear fusion research at a research lab to working at a bank doing IT. I mean, that's a fine job, but I don't think that was his first choice. My family went from living in a major city to having to move an hour away to be able
Choice.
to afford a
Interesting
one-room
word
apartment.
there.
Like literally a single room with fold-out couches that we slept on. Which, like, to be fair, no one had huge apartments in this place, but like, surely they had beds. I don't know. Hey, why are you being so?
Someone says she couldn't have been a Pole because Poles aren't that stupid.
But like, I
secretive? What country was this?
the reason why I think
tell you.
choice is an interesting word is because under the socialist ideal, her father wouldn't have a choice over where he works. Because as we've established, labor should be communally owned rather than
They didn't have
guided
that
by the
choice,
selfish
yes.
individual.
Yeah, like you didn't choose your job in the USSR. That's not how it worked.
Mhm.
If anybody says otherwise, they just don't know what they're talking about. That's not how it worked. I mean, I guess some people were able to do that, but you needed to know the bureaucrats and be on good favor with them. But like that's not choosing necessarily. That's just saying, hey, give me something good that I want, and luckily getting it.
But you probably won't believe me. Why not? Because it was the Soviet Union, and just by virtue of being alive in an anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-Russian society.
Soviet Union wasn't a country. A bunch of countries. What was like? What country? Well, she said she was born in it. When did she say she was born in? Did she say it was right after?
I think it
was
said
dissolved,
she said it
or
was
right
dissolved
before it was-
91, and she was born right after that.
Yeah, so she wasn't even born in the Soviet Union.
It's very likely that you hate the Soviet Union and the people who lived in it, particularly the Russians, which I am. I'm
There it is.
There we go. 7 minutes
Russian.
in, and we finally get
That's
it.
7 minutes and 37 seconds. 7:37. Let's go. The planes. Boeing. I love Boeing. Don't kill me.
way button down shirt. Okay, what else could I be? Yeah, I mean that place was so evil. We had a whole Cold War against them because they were just so bad. Yeah, because socialist systems don't tend to create shareholder value, and capitalists, particularly like
Oh my gosh. We did the Cold War. Was it about shareholder value? What nonsense. Like that really, really stemmed from like Stalin stealing the atom bomb.
Yeah, I do
really
believe
were.
actually. I remember a quote from Eisenhower, which said, "Those Soviets, they keep stealing all our shareholder value, so we need to get in there and stop it." Like that was the big justification. And then when they were going into Vietnam, they said those rice farmers, they're stealing our shareholder value, so we gotta get in there. This is every time they say this.
Oh man. Actually, like I mean, the U.S. supported the Soviet Union a lot initially, and of course, obviously, they supported them during World War II. Of course, right? I mean, you had the Russian Famine Relief Act, the 1920s. We gave them like almost $2 billion of government money and almost $2 billion of private money, bailed them out of the huge famine they were in. A lot of businesses were investing in the Soviet, which I'm not going to get it. But a lot of businesses were investing in the Soviet Union during the NEP days, New Economic Policy that I mentioned earlier, and even under Stalin. They were building factories. Like, I mean, it's kind of funny. They're hiring these people who work for capitalists to build all these factories instead of hiring their own workers to do it. Anyways, but I just don't know like how she can claim she like read up on this and know nothing about it. Like literally nothing.
No sources again.
foreign capitalist investors don't really like that, which is why our government tells us that every single socialist country is super repressive and terrible, even though it's not actually more repressive than like any other nation. Unfortunately, nations are just repressive by default. That's why the goal is a stateless, classless, mindless society. But they like executed a whole bunch of people, and Stalin was an evil dictator. The CIA declassified documents say that he was not a dictator.
Ah, there it is. Wait, let me finish this part real quick.
And they had like a vested interest in making sure that those were accurate, because if they took him out and he was a dictator, that would collapse the entire system. And if he wasn't a dictator, then taking him out would not collapse the entire system. And the CIA said themselves that actually he was pretty democratic over there. He was not a dictator. And yeah, obviously executing people isn't.
Okay. Let me actually pull this up. Let's see. Capitalism ruined my country. Oh my gosh, I hate this. I hate it so much. This is how you know someone is like actually illiterate. I don't think she cites any books in here, by the way. She has like the Wikipedia articles and definitely not Gallup. All right, let's do the CIA. We have to go over this. Very conveniently cropped in there, by the way. Let me see if I can go back a little bit. Let me hold on. Let me go back to this just to see just take note of where this stops. Present leaders, okay? Take note of
I
that,
didn't
guys.
go back on my screen
For me. Oh, it didn't? Did it not go back? Wait, let me press play and see if it helps.
The entire system.
Yeah, there we go.
And the CIA said
Is that
themselves
helping?
that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So take note of this where it stops. Present leaders, right? All right, now let's go over to the actual document. So I'd like to point out in relatively large letters right here, it says this is unevaluated information. So that's something interesting. Okay. Now, this is where she's quoting from paragraph 1. Now, this is where she left off. Can you see my mouse?
Yeah.
Okay, present leaders right here. What does it say down here?
From the
They call
point
it
of
the
view of
communist
upsetting the
dictatorship.
communist dictatorship since the death of Stalin.
They always crop that part out. They always do it. Because why wouldn't you, right? If you're saying, oh, they're saying it's not a dictatorship, but they're not saying that. This is what it says. Even in Stalin's time, there was collective leadership. The Western idea of a dictator within the communist setup is exaggerated.
Mhm.
So basically what they're saying here is that Stalin, well, I mean, it elaborates here. Stalin, although holding wide powers, was merely the captain of a team, and it seemed obvious that Khrushchev will be the new captain. I mean, first of all, I don't give a shit what's written in this little CIA page. There's no like citations. There's no actual arguments. This is just someone's opinion. Like, I don't care what this would say at all, because like, who cares? I mean, what like again, who wrote this? Like, right? Who wrote this? Unvalued information. Like, what is this? You know, it's just 2 pages. It just does not matter to me that much. There's just not enough information here. We have a lot of academic literature on Stalin's dictatorship, on the way the government functioned under Stalin, and stuff like that. To take this just because it's the CIA and they think, you know, oh, citing the CIA is always gonna mean they.
It means the
we're
capitalist
gonna win the
intelligence
argument.
agency.
It's just I mean, that's basically what they argue. But anyways, yes, there was collective leadership. There was a Politburo, there was the Central Committee. Hitler had collective leadership too.
Mhm.
Dictatorships do have collective leadership. It doesn't mean they don't have a dictator.
Mhm.
They acknowledge this as a dictatorship. They don't call it a democracy. That was a really blatant lie. I can understand misinterpreting it, but also she cropped it, so she probably was lying on purpose. But if you say this said it was democracy, it's a really blatant lie. There's a few other things like down here, like they're talking about how the material conditions aren't doing too great, like they're not making improvements. It's like it's not portraying Soviet Union in a great light at all. So that's just complete nonsense. Now she's about to justify executions.
Actually, he was pretty democratic over there. He was not a dictator. And yeah, obviously executing people isn't great. Like, the Soviet leadership was just kind of panicking. They were trying to keep alive a newly industrialized country that
They were trying to keep alive the dictatorship. That's what they were
And
doing.
the way you keep alive a newly industrial country is by executing people. Or being capitalist, by the way. Or for engaging in, speculation is the term. Yeah, they engaged in speculation. I.e., they had a bunch of resources. They were saving up those resources and hoping to sell them all. And that's speculation. That's evil. Execute that guy. Send him off to the gulag.
that had just survived 2 famines and a civil war in the preceding 2 decades, and Nazis were on their
They caused the famine.
The Nazis were there, though.
doorstep, and there was like corruption within the NKVD with like Yezhev maintaining quotas for how many people to execute. So like obviously there were a whole bunch of problems going on.
Then why did they give the Nazis so many resources? Explain that one, buddy. Why did they give the Nazis millions of gallons of oil? What was that all about? Just skip over that part. Actually, there's actually some evidence that Stalin even funded the Nazis in the very early days of the party. That's not stuff that like I would always take as 100%. It's more of like a she said type thing. But the thing is, we find it a couple of times appearing amongst relatively credible people. So it's just interesting if that were true as well. I wouldn't be surprised. There are some confirmed quotes and strategies that we have that suggest it could possibly be true, that they wanted Hitler to have power because it would cause a second imperialist war, and a second imperialist war would cause a a revolution, a huge revolution in Europe and perhaps the whole world.
Like, literally, like I said, there were problems. This place had problems. It wasn't perfect. There were contradictions. That's why it's good to learn history, so we know what went right, and we can aim towards those things and know what went wrong and try to avoid those. Oh, so you think everything the Soviets did was good then, and Stalin did nothing wrong? Typical for a Russian. I don't know when I ever said that. And that's a goofy statement to make. When Azerbaijan, Georgia, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all the Stans overwhelmingly voted to keep the USSR together.
And she leaves out the various independence referendums. So,
and also,
voters in the
I'm
Russian
interested
USSR
by her
voted to keep the Soviet Union.
terminology of there were contradictions. This is a common thing you'll see in communists, where they think that contradictions are actually real things that can exist out there. So there are contradictions in capitalism, and these contradictions will be resolved into a new synthesis. Like, so whenever you hear a communist speaking of contradiction, you know, a normal person, they hear contradiction and they think, oh, that thing doesn't exist. But the communist thinks, oh, the contradiction does exist, and that will lead to a new synthesis. And of course, they never say this openly, because it sounds fucking ludicrous that everything real is actually a contradiction and it leads to a new synthesis. But that is what they're meaning.
oh yeah, they'll actually try to completely avoid the synthesis terminology too, and they'll be like, Hegel never said synthesis. But I mean, that's what they're saying, right?
Yeah.
The contradiction between the workers and the owners, and the synthesis is worker owners. Like, everything they're saying is a synthesis.
My parents not included. Russians were the only ones who had a pretty decent time under the Soviet Union, which you can also see in the fact that there were no separatist movements in Soviet Central Asia or the
But Russians were much better off than the others. The Russians frequently oppressed other groups. They frequently like exploited them. I would say, especially under Stalin. Even though Stalin was Georgian, he was most favorable to the Russians very clearly.
Caucasus, and just like stop putting words in my mouth, like acknowledge that there were some bad things, yeah. And then there
I
were
like how
also
she's
some good
saying,
things, and
stop
stop
putting
using
words in
the
my
good
mouth.
stuff when you don't even have a connection
When
to this
she's
place.
arguing against herself, literally. She's literally arguing against herself here. And she's saying, stop putting words in my mouth.
Stop putting
Stop
words.
strawmanning
That's
me.
literally your mouth you're talking to. What the fuck? I love people debating themselves. It's so funny. It's so funny.
It's always
Like, you dumbass.
it's always the same shit. It's always so fucking lame. It's like, what the fuck are you even doing here?
Yeah, it's like I often will address potential rebuttals like in my videos. You know, I'll say, now some people might say this.
Hmm.
I don't have to make a fictional character and
Yeah.
then argue with them. That's so weird. I've done that
And then-
before, but
but
I did
it's
it
e- it's even-
ironically. I did
It's
it to
even
make fun of them.
crazier to have this fictional character and get angry at that fictional character for strawmanning you.
Why the fuck are you strawmanning me, you bitch? It's just her in the mirror.
Okay, whatever, bye. Okay. People think about the Dark
She's
Ages as
so
this tragic
pissed
time
off.
when we lost a ton of progress, which isn't even exactly true, but we don't tend to think of the fall of Eastern European communism and the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union as something that led to a dark age, though it kind of was, in a sense.
I would just like to say real quick. They often say illegal a lot.
Mhm.
I don't remember if the last guy used the terminology, but it comes up a lot. They're like, oh, the illegal embargo on Cuba, the illegal sanctions on Venezuela, illegal dissolution of the USSR, as if they give a fuck about the law.
Yeah.
Come on.
And like, what
the
even
only
is their
reason they do that is
what
try
is
to
their
add
theory
as
of
many
law
like derogatory terms.
like
What's that?
what even is their theory of law here? If the law is what the government says the law is, well then it wasn't, because the government said it was fine. Are they going to be natural law theorists here? In which case, okay, what's your natural law theory? And of course, people never think about this stuff, apart from Murray Rothbard. But it's important to think about.
Yes, like I asked somebody what the law was, made the embargo on Cuba legal, and they're like, "Oh, it's some thing from the United Nations." I'm like, first of all, LOL, United Nations, international law, haha, LOL, fake law, by the way. And I'm like, wait, so you think that all of this is like real law, and we all have to abide by that, and if anything goes against that, it's evil and illegal? No, they don't think that. They
Yeah.
don't think that. It's just trying to use as many derogatory sounding words in their sentences as possible to poison the well. Which again, I mean, some of this stuff I don't support. I don't support the sanctions of the embargo, but I don't have to use some things like illegal. I don't care if it's legal or not. It's bad. It's unethical.
There were so many scientists who were suddenly out of work and so many research projects that were halted and abandoned, all in the name of the free market. Think of all the research that never came to be and all of the things that were never learned as a result of the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union. Given that this country was the first one to put a dog.
The dog.
Yeah,
The
it's the dog.
You brought up the dog earlier. Oh man. Okay, let me. Oh, there's no. Oh god.
Here's
Trying to
here's
present
just
the Soviet Union.
here's just one point. Why is it that SpaceX are launching like a rocket every day, but the governments haven't been to the moon in decades? They've been shit. Capitalism is way better at space travel. Like, just empirically.
Yeah, and that's kind of an important point here, because he's referencing the space race, which in this case, this is a great example of a failure of central planning, because they're putting all these resources in a vanity project instead of helping their people who are starving. That's not a flex. But also, this is a race between two state-owned entities. This is not a capitalism versus socialism race. And it actually, the Soviet Union sort of made like an internal capitalism in their space program. They had something called internal competition, where they divided the space program into different sections and had them compete against each other for incentives. So their space program was more capitalist than ours. They never talk about that. But also, they like stole a bunch of stuff from the Germans, like the boosters they used to send up Sputnik. Those were just upscaled V2 rockets, which were Germans. I mean, a lot of these were German scientists, and and that's my next point is these are scientists innovating. Human beings innovate. Systems don't. Capitalism doesn't innovate. Socialism doesn't innovate. Innovation happens under every system, insofar as long as a person can actually act.
Yeah.
Like if a person's a total slave and they can't do anything, obviously they can't think, so on and so forth. If a person can actually act, if they can think, they're going to innovate. The question here is, which system maximizes this innovation? If we're talking about this, which system maximizes creativity and the ability for people to create, means for them to actually create things? And it's clearly capitalism. It's not even remotely debatable whatsoever here. Charles Murray has his book, what's it called? Human Accomplishments. He talks a bit about China and the Soviet Union, and like curiously, quite unusual from the rest of the world, like as soon as they became communist, you see a lot less great accomplishments coming out of these countries. You saw some coming out of them before, and then suddenly you're not seeing these accomplishments. He looks at many different areas, whether it be science or music and literature, and it just, all these innovations coming out of these countries just kind of disappear. And a lot of the technologies that the Soviet Union was using, like this is all like Western technologies. They weren't developing a lot of their own original stuff, but even then, yeah, there was scientists in the Soviet Union developing things, and you can actually find tons of stories of scientists who lived in the Soviet Union and had all these ideas, and it took them forever to get them off the ground because they were not granted the allocation of resources by the state, and they couldn't go to private investors. They couldn't go to like different. There was one investor, one, One investor. So they didn't have the option to find somebody else who actually liked their idea. They didn't have the option to go on Shark Tank and they're competing against to get the investments from like 5 different people who have different personalities and different interests, right? They don't have anything like that. One investor.
And it's like, let's imagine the ideal socialist space program where it doesn't have any of this evil competition or anything like that. Well, it would involve just the central planners telling each scientist what to think, what to implement at each point, and the scientists wouldn't be able to do their job.
Yeah, like there's a lot more points you could make there. Anthony Sutton actually has a couple of great books about innovation in the USSR. Where he also shows that a lot of their stuff was just taken from the West. And I have a video about where I go over a couple of different like prominent supposed Soviet inventions and kind of explain a bit about the stories of the people behind them and kind of what I was talking about, how they were like unable to get support, and some of them were like just entrepreneurs and they identified as capitalists and stuff. And were part of like little early capitalist parties in the Soviet Union when they were actually allowed to have those. So yeah, it's very silly. Anyways, and let's not mention, let's not forget like all of the oppression of scientists under people like Stalin. Like Senkoism. Like a lot of scientists were imprisoned, kicked out of their jobs, killed because they went against Marxist dogma, and that did not help. That was the collapse of science right there.
Like, what's the Marxist proof against, like, calculus or something? Like, that's a real thing.
Lysenkoism was just applying, like, Marxist philosophy to agriculture, and it was the dumbest thing ever. I was actually listening on Audible to a book recently called Elephant in the Brain. I think that's the title, Elephant in the Brain or Elephant in the Mind. And it's talking about the importance of competition in different species and the importance of competition in like plant species. I'm like, damn, if only Lysenko knew about this, because one of the things with them, like, oh, they need to cooperate with each other in their little commune, their little plant commune, plant them close to each other, and they'll have a little plant commune and help each other. It's not how it works.
We can safely say that the halt on research was a tragedy. There was probably a lot of cool stuff that just disappeared forever. I mean, the entire point of scientific socialism is to be scientific. It's literally in the name. The Soviets greatly prioritized science and knowledge, and that's why they gave everyone free, high-quality educations. One of the first initiatives upon the establishment
I like it's in the name, and then if you say they're national socialists, they will be like, whoa, just because it's in the name doesn't mean anything.
You forget it if you don't, because language perception and language production use separate parts of the brain. They're in different parts of the brain. So you can understand a language without actually speaking it. It's wild. One of the first initiatives upon the establishment of the USSR was a literacy campaign called LiquidZulu, or LiquidBes for short, which was intended to empower the working class and allow them to run society in their own interests. Knowledge is power, and if you want people to have power over how society is run, you're gonna.
One of the first things they did with that was they changed the definition of literacy to be a lot looser. So they instantly made millions of people literate overnight by just changing the definition.
Yeah, that's what you can do when you're a central planner. If you central plan knowledge, just central plan definition, just central plan fucking everything. Central plan the definition of good to just mean the Soviet Union.
Now we're good because we're the Soviet Union.
An education. Unfortunately, capitalist nations tend to have different priorities, like creating shareholder value and acquiring profits. So with capitalist shock therapy, a lot of
not
research
profits.
came to a halt. Culture seemed to have come to a halt too. I remember watching a lot of TV back then, and nearly everything I saw on TV was either American or Japanese, with a few Russian shows here and there, but mostly foreign stuff. The only Russian cartoons I recall watching had been ones made in the Soviet Union. My memory of my childhood is clearly flawed, so I don't know if I'm like 100% correct on this, but I want to say that for every Russian music video that I saw on MTV, I saw like 5 from the West. And a ton of the movies and shows that I watched were American ones, like Beavis and Butthead and Celebrity Deathmatch and The Blue Lagoon and Titanic, all of which were extremely appropriate for a 5-year-old. I mean, surely there must have been culture like Russian music and Russian TV shows and movies, some of which I vaguely remember watching, but given the fact that wealth became rapidly concentrated in the hands of a few oligarchs, it kind of makes sense that culture and science went from being prioritized to kind of declining for a little bit. But I mean, that really puts into perspective.
I don't want to get too much more into this. So there are some like other points in regards to the collapse in general that we can talk about. I mean, we already touched on this earlier. Like you were saying, kind of the Austrian business cycle stuff.
Mhm.
Let's see. This is a really good policy analysis from the Cato Institute from almost a decade ago now. But it kind of breaks down a bit of what was going on in these different countries, and it talks about like Poland and kind of the difference between the different countries' reform. So let's scroll down here real quick. So they divide them into different things. Like you got gradual reforms, limited reforms, aborted big bangs. So Russia is under aborted big bang. So like up here, they're Russia's reforms were far less rapid than those in the CEB, a fact consistent with the alternative interpretations of the Russian transition. The huge social cost imposed on the Russian population was not due to rapid reforms, but due to slow or non-existent reforms. And in some cases, they even like reverse things. So like Jaeger Gator, he was he was an economist. And I think his position, he became like the first prime minister of Russia, if I'm not mistaken, for a brief period. 1992 reforms soon ran into opposition, and he was removed from government. Some of his reforms were eventually reversed. So that's why it's categorized as aborted Big Bang. Now you contrast Russia with like Poland, like I was talking about earlier. I said some statistics on that. Poland, like down here, Poland's Big Bang reforms were the first among transition countries, and Poland was much more successful than many of these other countries because they actually went through these reforms. And there's a lot of data about this in this paper. I really highly recommend it. Now, there's also a few other points I'll make on Russia's transition. Of course, there's a lot of corruption because there was still a lot of central planning happening at this time. Actually, the biggest redistribution program in Russia's history, or the Soviet Union's history, happened at the fall of the Soviet Union when they were so-called liberalizing it. They had these little vouchers for thousands of rubles, and they gave them out to a bunch of the people, workers and stuff. And these were vouchers to buy parts of factories and means of production and stuff like that. But they also were shutting down the factories and they weren't letting them run. They were just not letting them run. People couldn't go to work and they were just stopping things from being produced, making all these crazy, insane decisions that were not informed by by economists or not, at least not reasonable economists, or some of the Harvard boys. That's kind of the distinction here. They had the Harvard boys instead of someone like the Chicago boys, or like people influenced by the Austrian school. That unlike what happened in Poland and East Germany, these had people who were influenced by Austrians. Chile had people influenced from the Chicago school. This was very different. This was the Harvard boys. This was Keynesians. Not good. So they had these like redistribution programs. They're shutting down all the factories. They have these little vouchers. And what are you going to do? You want food, right? You want actual money. So they sold the vouchers on discounted to these guys who had all this money saved up. And that's how some of the oligarchs were created, because they bought tons of these vouchers and then went and bought factories and businesses, which were shut down by the government. And it was just a total mess. I really recommend listening to Scott Horton's podcast episode where with Ann Williamson, where she talks about the entire process and how it was not an example of a failure of capitalism.
Hmm.
She's actually going to be publishing a book on that too. She wrote it a while ago, but she's like writing it because she never actually published it in the first place. And yeah, Libertarian Institute is going to put that out when she's done with it.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to go much further on this. It's kind of late, so.
I mean, yeah, we could cap it off there.
You just kind of say a bunch of unsourced things.
Yeah, I mean, it was great having you on, man. Thank you.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, this is kind of a little bit of an experiment. I'm hoping that me and Zulu can do like weekly streams together under like a new banner, like I don't know, some sort of podcast name or something that reflects both of us, and do stuff like this, and also do like debates and call-in stuff. Sometimes just reacting to stuff, sometimes just debates, Q&A. Stuff like that. I feel like that would be a lot of fun. So I just wanted to kind of experiment with that. I don't have the time to start it quite yet, but I'm getting there quite soon.
Yeah, it's hopefully it happens because it'll be very fun. Yeah, it was
It'll help after I get my new audio interface.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I mentioned to you in Discord the other day that I ordered it and they just never shipped it. So I canceled the order and ordered another one from a different company, and I'm finally getting it.
Nice. Yeah, so
I
it
had to
was,
pay
it was
$2 extra though.
great having you on. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later, I suppose.
Yeah, I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Yeah. Stream there.